Coming to you live from the Pipeline Studios. I am Wes Carter. I'm going to start over.
That was perfect.
PK's making me laugh.
That was perfect.
Yeah.
I hope you're recording.
Yeah.
Just talk.
Yeah. PK's making me
The
laugh.
best is coming to you live.
Coming to you live. I get a lot of
Get that South
I get a lot of shit about 9 too. All right. Let's see how I want to start this.
Say it with a straight face. Do it again.
All right. Coming to you live from the Pipeline Studios in Oahu. We are here today with a really special guest. I'm your host, Wes Carter, sitting in for Barton Lynch, and really pleased to have Tulsi Gabbard with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's been a really great day here. We had the first day of competition for the Billabong Pros. Saw a lot of really good surfing. Had a beautiful day. So we're all very stoked right now.
Yeah. As how can you not be here with that view and in this environment? It's special, very special.
It's been very special. You know, this whole journey that we've been on around creating an initiative around sustainability, trying to activate the surfing industry and the people in surfing to really be our ambassadors for a more sustainable planet, has all culminated here. And it's really been the ethos of the Hawaiian Islands and aloha culture has really been a big part of what has fueled this. And being from Hawaii, I'm really curious to hear just how being a Hawaiian and growing up here influenced your worldview. I know when we first met, you mentioned to me that conservation was a big driver for you originally getting into politics. And so I'd love to hear that story.
Well, first, let's talk a little bit about how we first met.
Okay, absolutely.
It was a year ago.
Yeah.
It was a year ago, right here in this yard.
Literally, probably,
Almost to the day.
Yep.
And I was kind of blown away because I was talking to PK, and he's like, "Hey, you got to meet Wes Carter because we're doing something really cool." And I walked away from our conversation very inspired. I was talking to my husband as we were driving home because, like, out of the blue, here's this business guy from South Carolina coming and talking to me on the North Shore of Hawaii about how to save the planet.
Southern accent and all.
All of it. The whole thing. And I just, we ended up having a really amazing long conversation. And I just walked away feeling like, oh my gosh, like 2 different people, 2 different backgrounds, 2 different experiences and upbringings, but very passionate about these precious resources, whether it's the ocean and water or soil and land, all of the things that we think about when we talk about conservation, how critical it is for us to be responsible in preserving what is necessary for us to survive, really, is what it comes down to. And that is what got me involved in politics in the first place. Growing up here in Hawaii, when we look around us, how can you not be inspired to want to protect this beautiful place, to protect the clean water that we have to drink here in Hawaii? I started co-founded a nonprofit as a teenager. We had a program because I was thinking, okay, well, we can go out and clean up beaches every weekend, and we did, but it was pretty disheartening to go back the next week and be like, oh man, there's a lot more trash here. Right. And it's just like this endless cycle. How do you actually start to bring about more change so that you're not being so reactive, but actually being proactive? And so in that nonprofit Healthy Hawaii Coalition, I came up with a program that we took out to, first, second, third graders in schools all across the state that was really centered around if we can help educate our kids about basic things like, why is clean water important? Why is it important to keep our oceans clean and not throw our soda cans out the window when we're driving down the street, not pouring crap down, into the storm drains, knowing where that ends up. Sure. And it was an incredible thing for me as a teenager doing that, to see the light bulb go off in these kids' eyes. Because I came up with this little skit called The Adventures of Water Woman, and it was Water Woman versus her nemesis, Oily Al, and Oily Al didn't care about anything. Water Woman saved the day in the nick of time, and it was so fun to do, but to see that light bulb go off in these kids' eyes and see, like, oh, wow. Understanding the basic concept of there are consequences to our actions. And if we care about this place, if we care about clean water, protecting our home, then there are things that each of us can do every day to advance that cause. later on, I was a part of an effort to, getting petition signatures and whatnot to stop a landfill from being built over one of our major water aquifers here in Hawaii. In Hawaii, we get our drinking water from these water aquifers, and if those water aquifers are poisoned, as the most remote island chain on the planet, we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, well, the next state over can just truck in clean water for us. There are water crises happening all across the country, whether you're talking about Flint, Michigan, or Jackson, Mississippi, where that is literally what they have had to or are having to do is truck in bottled water because they don't have a clean water source. We have beautiful, clean drinking water here. I was a part of stopping a landfill from being built over one of those water aquifers through grassroots action. People stepping up and saying, hey, no, we're not going to allow this big money landfill guy to go grease the wheels and pay off corrupt politicians and get this thing through, which is what was happening. And through grassroots action, we stopped it. And that was an amazing thing for me to experience as a teenager about how to impact and affect change. And ultimately, that's what drove me to run for the state house here in Hawaii back in 2002, when I was 21 years old, total introvert, no political training, debate training, no big party boss or anybody, frankly, anybody who had any influence. They didn't come to me and say, oh, well, you're the chosen one. We want you to go do this. No, it was literally me sitting in my computer and coming up with this janky black and white brochure and going out and knocking on doors and talking to people.
And was conservation a big part of your initial platform?
Absolutely.
And when you were out there speaking to the constituents, was it about pollution in particular, or was it all about clean water, or was sustainability even a thing at that point? Was it conservation related? Was it endangered species? Like what exactly at that point in time were you really focused on?
So I was running for state house in Eva Beach, which at that time, and maybe it still is, but at that time it was the fastest growing community on the island. So a lot of explosion in infrastructure needs, and what do we do with, waste? What do we do with, water and sewage infrastructure? Really talking about taking an old plantation community and looking at the explosive growth that was planned for that community and was happening. So it was kind of a lot of those things wrapped up into, obviously I talked a lot about my own motivation, what inspired me to run, because I saw a lot of politicians in our state legislature who, they'd lived their lives and had careers and were retired and then ran for office. But they, by and large, not all, but most of them were not people who go out and surf on the weekends or go out, for dawn patrol in the morning, where I didn't feel like our leaders represented that kind of passion and care for our environment and what clean water that I felt a sense of urgency about. And so for our community, it was about that, but it was also about growth and responsible growth and how do we take care of our community while recognizing, there are more homes, more jobs, more roads, more infrastructure needs that we have. How do we go forward and do this right?
And you grew up surfing. Like surfing was a part of your life since you were
the ocean. Absolutely, yes. I took my first swimming lessons at Ala Beach in town on a boogie board and was, fall like Mike Stewart bodyboarding I was all about it. Mm-hmm. And then a friend of mine gave me one of his old surfboards. It was a 7.0 gun. It was like, here, you want to learn how to surf? Use this. And it was like quite possibly the worst surfboard to try to learn on. I was, I think, too embarrassed to go to any of like the big spots. I was living in town at the time. And so I used to go to this spot. I forget what it's called, but it's out by Sand Island, which is where like all the industrial, it is the industrial part of the island. But there's a little breakout there. I was able to go and like crash and burn constantly until I finally worked through the frustration to get up and actually catch some waves, and I was hooked from there.
And being a surfer, obviously, that was a big part of influencing a lot of this passion around conservation. Because what I have seen, and when we first started this initiative around a New Earth, this idea of activating the surfing community, it felt like a really good lane. But what I have been really overwhelmed by is how passionate this community is. And my sense is, because it's what makes me so passionate about it, is people that spend a lot of time in nature, people who spend a lot of time in the ocean, taking care of those natural resources is just so obvious.
Yes.
And so like people come to me all the time and say, where does a passion come from? Like the passion just comes from being alive, really, and spending time outside and enjoying these natural resources and wanting to preserve them.
Yes.
And one thing you talked about, which I think is something that I've become very aware of, is we've been in this culture of sort of growth for the sake of growth. Our economic system is all based on growth. And for the last 100 years, that worked pretty well. But all of a sudden, we are realizing that there's all these unintended consequences for that growth. And to me, as a culture, it is time for us to begin to wake up and really understand that there are not unlimited resources, and if we don't begin to manage our resources better and acknowledge, more than anything else, acknowledge that we have a very significant impact, and we need to be creating systems within the private sector supported by governments that acknowledge that impact. In this work over the last few years, and obviously I'm not nearly as deeply involved in politics as you are, but I have been pretty stunned at the lack of understanding of that. And that the priorities, at least with the people I've talked to, tend to be overwhelmingly on economic growth.
Hi.
Hey, Carissa Moore.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
What's up, Liz?
All's well.
PJ told me to do it.
Absolutely.
Oh,
All right.
Nice to see
Good luck.
you. Take care.
Good luck. Do what Tulsi told you.
She's so lovely.
She's
Sorry to interrupt the flow.
No, she's so lovely. But no, so I would like to hear your perspective because, I have to acknowledge that, it is the perspective that I have through the work that I've been doing. And I feel like there's so much educating that has to be done. And I talk to a lot of people that have been in politics a long time, and I'm stunned often how little they understand about things like our current waste infrastructure. Is waste circularity a priority? Things like, why don't we have recycling standards in this country?
Right.
Why don't we expand industrial composting? 40% of the food we grow, we throw away. Yeah. Like there's some really obvious low-hanging fruit. And one of the things I also come to realize is we cannot do this without the support of government. So I know this is a complex question, but like, where do you see the role of government, where it's been, where it needs to go, federal, state, local? Please educate me and everyone who's listening on like how can this work? And I'll leave it with this. I mean, I've yet to find anyone who's pro-pollution. Like it feels to me like this should be the least partisan issue in the history of the world.
Yes.
Can we all agree that plastic in the ocean is bad?
Right.
Like this should not be partisan.
Right.
So if we can all agree on that, solution should be the next thing that we go to.
Yeah. You're right. You're not going to find somebody who's pro-pollution, but I guess I'll start with the reality of Washington, first of all, which is what drives so many of our politicians' decisions. It is their desire to either get more power or stay in power. So much of their ability to do that is based on, and this is not right, but it is reality. So much of their ability to do that is based on who is funding their campaigns and their ability to amass that so-called power. And this is where the private sector and those in government have very important roles in bringing about this kind of change. So I'll use the Farm Bill as an example, because it is a massive piece of legislation that has far-reaching implications that go beyond, obviously it has to do with agriculture, but a lot of people don't know and realize it also has to do with funding for school lunches. It has to do with food stamps. And
I certainly would not have known that.
It is one of those pieces of legislation, like the National Defense Authorization Act, that those in Congress say this is a must-pass bill because of how far-reaching the impacts are. And so when you look at, okay, well, who's helping to shape that legislation? When you look at private industry and lobbyists and their political action committees that have a massive amount of influence over what goes on in that bill, sadly, from a farming perspective, for example, they're not placing an emphasis on, okay, what are the farming practices that we in government can support to help protect the quality of our soil so that we can continue to actually grow food to feed people in this country. Regenerative farming practices, incentivizing things that are rooted in true conservatism and conservation. Instead, it ends up benefiting a lot of these corporate factory farms that are poisoning our water, sucking everything they possibly can out of our soil, and then picking up and moving on to somewhere else once they can't farm there anymore, and focused solely on, hey, how do we make the most money? Period. It's not an either or, and that's been the problem. It's whose team are you on?
Sure.
You're either on this team or that team, and unfortunately, it has led to a lot of judgment and an adversarial mindset instead of saying, well, hey, we can and should advance both causes together.
But I think what you're describing is not an education problem. It's not that the politicians necessarily don't understand it. It's a systematic problem.
It's both. I think a lot of politicians don't care to understand it. What is important to them doesn't require it. I wish we, and look, I mean, this is a much bigger thing about politics and ultimately for people who are like getting fired up and was like angry listening to this, because it's messed up. We have to remember that our founders created this country and crafted a Constitution, Bill of Rights that tells us we, the people, are a self-governed people. And so as messed up as our political system is, and it is pretty jacked up right now, the fact remains, how do we change it? We are the only ones that can change it. And when you have half the country that doesn't even show up to vote, well, we're not going to see the kind of change that we need.
So the role of lobbyists,
Yes.
the role of money in politics, basically, as well as career politicians that are basically pandering to the special interests.
Right.
Like that system is at the root of not just this problem, of many, many problems.
Yeah.
So that begs the question.
I would say everything that's wrong with our politics is rooted in that.
And I have witnessed that in the private sector when you're trying to engage governments to support these things. Like, as an example, I work with a lot of groups where you got companies of all different shapes and sizes for every industry vertical, and there is a lot we agree on.
Yeah.
Waste infrastructure, recycling. How do we expand composting so we're not throwing so much food away? How do we create cleaner waste streams to feed all these products that we're making all the time so we're not having to use natural resources? Everybody agrees on that stuff. But then when it comes to we need governments to support that, that's where we hit a wall. And so from your perspective, I mean, and this is not exactly where I was planning to go, but I think it is the theme of the frustration from everyday Americans like me who are going, we need change. We have systematic problems in this country, and what can we do to change them? And as somebody who's trying to do that, with the support of a lot of other folks, it's brick wall after brick wall, and it's so frustrating, and it's almost like, I feel like sometimes the politicians are hoping that we give up, like stop bothering us, and we're putting, very sensible ideas in front of them. Is it term limits? I mean, what are some things that, everyday Americans can be supporting that would help break this stalemate?
Basically prohibiting PAC and lobbyist contributions of politics. That would have an immense effect. You're shifting the priorities of how a member of Congress spends their day and who they're spending it with and who they're listening to. It is not only not uncommon, it is the norm in Washington for a member of the House or the Senate to spend breakfast, lunch, and dinner having fundraisers with a bunch of lobbyists from a whole host of industries. And in between those breakfast, lunch, and dinner fundraisers, which basically is, the member of Congress shows up and sits there, and maybe there's a round table of 12 or 15 lobbyists, or maybe a smaller number if they're writing bigger checks, and you go and you spend an hour or two with them, and then you walk out with an envelope full of money for your campaign. And then in between those breakfast, lunch, and dinners spent with lobbyists, they're making phone calls, inviting more lobbyists to the next breakfast, lunch, and dinner fundraising events. And when you look at how much, with limited time and every day, when you look at how much time our elected leaders are spending either with with lobbyists raising money from them, or on the phone, getting them to come to these events or getting them to give them their checks. They're spending more time on that than they are actually doing their job. Sitting in a committee hearing, studying the issues, educating themselves, learning more, becoming more informed about, okay, hey, there's this proposal before us in Congress. Let's figure out actually what does it do? Who does it hurt? Who does it help? What are the downstream effects of this, that the unintended consequences that we might not be realizing even with the best of intentions behind the proposal? Taking those lobbyists and PAC contributions off the table would completely change, at a basic level, how a member of Congress spends their day.
Sure.
How much time they're spending listening to constituents, or talking to small business owners, or talking to people who are doing the work that you're doing, to actually say, okay, wow, I didn't realize that this was the case, or I didn't realize that we had these opportunities. Let's figure out how we can start to solve some of these problems.
Are they reluctantly engaged in it? Do most people sit around and go, this system really is broken, we really need to find it? Or is it just part of the culture of Washington that it just perpetuates itself?
It is the culture of Washington. It is the culture of the swamp. It is what makes the swamp the swamp. And, there are some people who, when I first went to Congress, I took some, not all. I was selected, but I took some PAC and lobbyist contributions. And so I can talk about this because I've been there and I've gone through it, and I hated it. And it just felt so wrong. And so I stopped before much time had passed. And immediately I saw in my own schedule how much things had changed, how, the conversations that I was having with people. I know there are many, I would venture to say, as an educated guess, that there are most members of the House and the Senate who just accept that this is the way things are. And so that's what they do. There are very few who I've had conversations with who felt the way that I did, feel sickened by the process, and recognize that this is not the right way to do things. But very few have the courage to then follow that up with action and say, well, I'm not going to play that game. On a positive note, there are more people that I've seen, both in recently, I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, who've gotten elected to Congress, as well as those who have run for Congress, who from the outset, from the beginning of their campaign, they say, I'm not taking any corporate money.
Sure.
At all, whether it's through PACs or through lobbyists. And so that's where, for people at home, I am skeptical. Are members of Congress going to prohibit themselves from taking this PAC and lobbyist money when, for many of them, that makes up 70, 80, 90% of their campaign kind of treasure? No, it's not likely. But
not they want to get elected.
Well, right, because it would require them to stop spending so much time with lobbyists and go back home and spend time with their constituents and earn their support. But that's where, okay, well, how do we start to spur this change? As you're thinking about who to vote for, ask them the question. Ask these candidates the question when they knock on your door at a town hall meeting or whatever it is. Do you take PAC and corporate PAC money and lobbyist money? And in some cases, you're going to have a choice between some candidates that do and some candidates that don't. And then we as voters, can then start to spur that change by making that decision about how we cast our votes.
That actually is a really important piece of information for people to understand.
Yeah.
That one piece of information can influence the way people vote. And over time, that can have a serious impact on the broken system. So I really appreciate that perspective.
I'll give you one other anecdote that has to, that kind of proves this point. Candidates that I've seen and candidates that I've supported who don't take any corporate and PAC money, they're very outspoken about issues like, big pharma, the military-industrial complex, the agriculture complex.
They can be.
Right, like they are speaking the truth and taking principled stance, whereas other people that I know who are taking this money and go through that kind of schedule that I go through, and they're good people, they feel like this is what they have to do in order to stay in office. There are a number of examples I could cite, but big pharma is one. We know how powerful big pharma is. You see their ads everywhere. Big Pharma spends more money on lobbyists and PAC contributions than they do on those TV ads that we see all day, every day on television.
Now that's staggering.
It is, because you have an idea of how expensive TV is. I certainly know. They spend more money in Washington trying to influence politicians than they do on those television ads. So that gives you an idea of how influential Big Pharma is in Washington. So we now understand, knowing that, well, gosh, no wonder Big Pharma can't be sued for a new vaccine that they come out with that ends up having negative consequences on someone has a negative reaction. They can't sue those companies that come up with these vaccines or these new medications. They're not, by law, we're not allowed to hold them accountable. There are so many different examples. The federal government cannot negotiate lower prices as a customer of Big Pharma in many cases. It's starting to change a little bit, but whether we're talking about the VA or Medicare, Medicaid, the U.S. government is the number one customer of Big Pharma as an industry. And yet our own laws limit us from negotiating lower prices on behalf of the American taxpayer across the board. So how is this possible? A friend of mine who was running for re-election, part of the ad that was produced was, hey, we need to fight to lower prescription drug prices, especially for our seniors, and allow us to be able to import drugs from other countries like Canada. The ad was produced. Supporters in Big Pharma saw the ad and said, if you don't cut that ad, if you don't pull that ad and kill it, you can kiss the millions of dollars that we had budgeted for your campaign goodbye. Guess what happened? The ad ended up in the trash can. And so these are, when we talk about the choices that voters have, these are the kinds of things that we end up with when we have people who care more about what their corporate donors want than what is best for people and our health and well-being in this country.
Wow. That is shocking. I mean, I think we all understand that Washington is broken. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on. I mean, we all look around and go, there's so many obvious areas that the federal government could do a better job, and in some cases, a much better job. And I think for everyday Americans, it's really frustrating not understanding the dynamics that you're articulating. When we look, what it brings me back to is a lot of these issues that we are working on right now around conservation, around sustainability, have a level of urgency to
Yes.
The rate at which we are, as an example, putting plastic into the ocean is growing exponentially. Estimates are that by 2040, we will put 36 million tons of plastic in the ocean every year, which is triple the rate of today. And if you just walk the beaches here in Hawaii, there's plastic everywhere. And so the thing that concerns me the most is I feel like there is a freight train coming that it's a tidal wave, and nobody really understands it. And we are trying to educate and say, guys, we got to do things now. We got to do things quickly, or we are all going to pay a very heavy price. So from your perspective, knowing that the likelihood that the federal government is going to shift enough to be able to help us do this on any kind of grand scale in the next 15 to 20 years, does it mean that the private sector, more than anything else, is going to have to collaborate? We're going to have to regulate ourselves. I mean, some of that's already happening, whether it be carbon disclosure or people making plastic reduction commitments, all these kind of things. I mean, there is a regulation within the private sector that's very public, and I think companies more and more are recognizing that how they operate as an organization ethically, their consumers are aware of that more and more with media being so everywhere. People can get that information more and more. But is the role of government in supporting this? If it's not the federal government, should it be state and local governments? Because I'm assuming what you're articulating is not as prevalent at the state and local level.
Yeah, I mean, those are some, I think this really gets to the crux of how we move forward. We should not underestimate the power of local municipal government and state government. The federal government gets the most attention on national television, but I served on the Honolulu City Council here in Hawaii, for example, and our city council is one of the bigger and more powerful councils across the country, because here on the island of Oahu, we have 9 council members, and each one represents over 100,000 constituents. compare that to a state senator here in Hawaii who represents roughly 25,000 people, a member of the state house, maybe 10,000 people. So you look at the impact just by scale. It's pretty massive. And then you look at the decisions that are made at the municipal level by council members and mayors. It has to do with zoning, how we are handling our production of waste and what we're doing with it. And obviously this applies across the country. And so when you're looking at where the rubber meets the road, a lot of that much of that happens at the local level, where we zoning for growth and development and agriculture and waste. How are we planning for that? Not only for where we go in the next 10 years, but where we go for the next 50 years. It's one of those places, in Washington, things are kind of run through the 2-year and 4-year election cycles, unfortunately. So things end up being very reactive rather than saying, hey, here's our 20-year plan to get us to a place where we are not seeing waste as waste, but whether waste is energy or finding ways to get to a zero waste solution. A lot of those conversations are happening at the local level because they have to.
Right.
Because and we've had it here on Oahu. It's like you can't run away from the question of the landfill is full. Where are you going to put it?
You can only dig so many holes.
You can only dig so many holes, especially on an island. But also, you go around to which community is going to raise their hand and say, yeah, sure, we'll take the landfill in our backyard. That happens never. But that's my need, is there are very practical problems that require practical solutions. And I think at the local level, at the state level, at the local level here, there's 9 members of the city council. You count to 5, you're able to pass a bill. You're able to pass legislation and get change, make that kind of impact.
Are you supportive of EPR, like what just passed in California, SB 54?
I'm not familiar with that.
Extended producer responsibility, where basically the state government is taxing things like single-use plastic at a higher level to help pay for greater recycling infrastructure. I know Hawaii is talking about some EPR bills as well, but it's sort of like we've discussed. It's where the states are saying we're going to take responsibility for regulating waste in our communities to honestly try to keep things out of the landfill and in circulation, by really evening the playing field and said, if a company is going to choose to use really problematic materials, then those materials are going to carry a tax, and that tax revenue is actually going to go to help fund greater infrastructure around circularity.
I don't know. I don't know if I support that because I first of all would have to look at the details of the proposal. I support that corporate responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, when these kinds of taxes are, and it's why I haven't supported a carbon tax either, because it's not the company that's paying the tax, it's the consumer that's paying the tax. And so when we look at how to bring about the kind of change that we want to bring about, ultimately in those examples, again, I'd have to look at these specific proposals.
Sure.
In the past. What is incentivizing the company to bring about more change if they're just passing on the cost to the consumer and it's making it harder for people without means to, do what they want to do? Saying that though, when people look at, well, this is something I really care about, and how can I be a part of bringing about change if I'm not the owner of a big corporation or I'm not sitting in government? It is about making those informed and educated choices when you're looking at the different practices of different companies and those who are making those conscious decisions about how to conserve and protect our natural resources and our environment versus those who are not. And that is also a way about how every one of us as individuals can help to influence those decisions that are being made by those corporations.
It's because we are all so connected through media now. Everyday people can express their perspectives on a company, on a product, on how they're packaging things, and celebrate the ones that are doing it really well. And so from that perspective, consumers are taking the power back.
Exactly.
And the power of media, actually, and even social media, has really given everyday Americans and world citizens really much more power and the ability to give feedback to these companies. And so that gives me a lot of comfort for the future, a lot of hope for the future. Because at the end of the day, I think we can all agree, like when the power is with the people, positive things happen.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's people being able to, like you, for example, Wes, like you grew up around the ocean, not the Pacific Ocean, but you grew up around the ocean. And you are a leader of a major industry in this country. And there was something in you that sparked you to start doing exactly what you're doing. You're sharing your own story with others about what you've loved the ocean your whole life. I've seen where you grew up. I've talked to your parents. But there was something that took you to a place where you're like, oh, this is what I have to do. I have to do something.
Right.
No one else is gonna do. I have to do something. And so you started a New Earth project, and you're incredibly passionate about the work that you're doing, sharing your story about what made you cross that bridge from being somebody who loves the ocean and loves the environment to then like, no, I got to be part of the solution. That has the ability to inspire not only other industry leaders, but also just people everywhere who are trying to figure out what they can do. It's an amazing thing to see how people are making decisions about where they spend their money and who they give their attention to, talking about social media, because of their values and what's important to them. If you support American businesses, for example, you're going to think like, okay, hey, I'm going to check and see where this product was made. And maybe it costs a little bit more than a comparable product that's made somewhere else, but it's important to me to take that step and support that. It's important to support a business or an industry or an effort that actually is walking the walk in protecting our precious open spaces and our ocean. Too often people feel helpless and hopeless, that none of us as individuals have the ability to impact the kind of change that we want to see. And it's just not true. It's not true. When we look at all major changes that we have seen throughout history, they have been made possible by individuals stepping up and saying, what can I do? And turning that question into action.
Well, that is a great place to close, because that is exactly what we tried to do with the New Earth Project. I mean, our tagline is we do this together, and we invite everybody. Bring your talents, bring your passion. We need people from all across the spectrum, to bring their unique individual talents together to create these solutions. And I just can't thank you enough for supporting what we're doing and giving us your perspective. It's really valuable. So thank you, Tulsi.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for taking the lead and fighting this great fight.
Yes, ma'am.